see if it works. That is me.
Oh, that's
so that's so far. Yeah, cool. Right. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. By the way, this is really cool. I'm going to try and do something a bit different here. This is usually the part of someone's talk where they go on about the amazing people they've worked for and the amazing achievements which they managed to do. I'm going to do it the other way. I'm going to talk about all of the things which make me feel embarrassed and vulnerable. So is everyone up for that? Yeah, great. Okay. So I've basically had a history of mental illness that started with around the time I was about 17. I guess I had adolescence depression, and that kind of transformed into anorexia. It got to the point at one stage where I had a family member refer to me as the refugee, and when I needed a piss, I could actually see my own bladder through the front of my body. So that wasn't very good. That moved on from that into developed a panic disorder. Something they don't tell you about when it comes to eating disorders is when you don't eat a lot, your body tries to fight back to the extent that eventually you have really, really quite painful heart palpitations and spontaneous blindness for periods of time. So that was good too. It's difficult to explain how badly that affects how to actually get things done in your life as well, and it sort of makes you agoraphobic and stuff like that too. Then that sort of developed into major depressions and things like that. I'm kind of going through a bit of a major depression at the moment. It's sort of like being normal, but at the same time thinking that you don't deserve to exist, or you don't feel as if you actually do exist, like you're some sort of spectre, and only the people around you are real. And I also have sort of PTSD because of all of these other things. I was kind of vulnerable and didn't have a lot of self-esteem or anything like that. So I ended up in bad situations and relationships. And so now I'm sort of hyper-vigilant, so I spend most of my time worrying about things going on around me far too much and not sleeping. So that I thought was an interesting experiment. The reason for it being that I think it's important that we're able to be vulnerable and talk about our vulnerabilities and talk about the things we're not proud of. If people like me who would otherwise perhaps be seen as someone who's successful and okay, get up and talk about them, then maybe other people will feel more comfortable about it. Obviously, it's kind of awkward. So let's move on a little bit from that. Oh yeah, and also I get migraines. Not as bad as some of the other things on the list, but what tends to happen is that once I'm having a good day, because I'm not suffering so much from any of this sort of thing, my body relaxes and then my ocular nerve sort of spasms, and then I have a sort of micro stroke, which is a migraine. So when I'm feeling good, my body then decides, no, you're not going to feel good, you're going to have a migraine instead. So it's all right. I mean, basically, most of my adult life has been as a physical, mental and emotional wreck. But when I'm able to have a good day, I work on stuff to do with accessibility, because through all of that, I've sort of learned that people are vulnerable, people do find things hard, and it's easier for them if you help them out. So I'm just going to talk about general sort of bits and pieces to do with accessibility, some of the things I've been working on, some of the things I've been thinking about, and then perhaps later today we can have discussions about it and we can try and work towards sort of improving some of the little ideas I've come up with. First though, I need to point that at that, don't I? So the first thing that I want to do is to kind of make this distinction between inclusive design and accessibility. Because I call myself an inclusive designer more so. I'm a designer, although a lot of the work I do is accessibility remediation, which is kind of fixing accessibility. I think having accessibility in the design process is really, really important for actually getting properly compelling, accessible products. So I want to tell you a little anecdote about the difference between the two. If the forthcoming anecdote doesn't make very much sense to you, then there is also an article that I wrote here called What the Heck is Inclusive Design, and that hopefully will help, and that sort of puts it in contrast to accessibility. So this small anecdote is called The Door, and what was happening was my wife does some charity work, she does some volunteer work in a church, a converted church, where she looks after refugee children, where people have moved to our town of Norwich, whilst their parents go out and look for work. And I, being a dickhead, had forgotten my keys one day, so I had to go there to go and get my wife's set of keys from her so I could get into my own house, which is also my office. And so I approached the building and I went up to the door, which had 2 handles, and I tried to grab the handles and open the door. And it didn't really like budge, so I was like really giving it a lot of welly like that and really shaking it. And then I heard this guy inside go, no, 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 like that, and get really, really worked up. And he ran up to the door and he pointed angrily at this large button on the wall. And this button had like a wheelchair icon on it. And he pointed at that like that, so I had to press that to open the doors. And then eventually I could get in. And he said, you idiot, I can't believe you were trying to, you'll break the door. Like, he couldn't get his head around why I would do that, despite the fact that everything about that door told me that it would operate as a normal door. So I'm not a structural engineer or the sort of person who designs doors, but hopefully by way of analogy, this will tell you something about what I think the difference is between accessibility and inclusive design. Now, that door was accessible. It's accessible in the sense that if I pressed the button, it would open. And it's accessible in the sense that more people alive probably could press that button and open the door than people who were able to do it manually by pulling the handles. So that's kind of good, but the problem is that the door appeared as if it could be used like any other door at the same time. So for someone who would use a door in the normal fashion, it completely threw me. There was no way of it explaining to me that it worked differently. So what I came up with was this rudimentary pulley system thing here, where if you go like this, then it pulls in and it opens up, and that's if you press the button. So it like this mechanically pulls it in, or you could approach the door and you could just push it and it would just go slack and you get in like that. Now, obviously, that's not a very good design. You get all sorts of stuff tangled up in there and what have you. But the point is that that's sort of like an inclusive design. It works as expected, but also it has a provision which means that it's able to be used in a different way. There's a choice. All technologies are assistive technologies. This is something that, I wasn't the first person to say this, but it's been in conversations a lot recently. Is the idea that, like a screen or a keyboard or anything we normally use is an assistive technology, unless it's actually a technology which is trying to eradicate the human race, then it actually should be there to assist us in some way. But if it's inclusive, then it's one which more people than normal could use. It's something that more people will be able to make part of their routine. Okay, so this is now just launching into bits and pieces that I've been thinking about, maybe things we can talk about. This kind of constant battle between developer experience, DX, and user experience, UX. So, so a lot of people will justify inaccessible interfaces by saying, well, but I like doing it this way, I like using this library because it makes it easier for me as a developer. Now, developers also are people, kind of. But the point is that their job is to try and make things good for users, right? So anything which makes life easier for a developer but then diminishes the user experience obviously is something that you want to avoid. However, I've been thinking about and experimenting within the field or within the area of trying to make adding accessibility provisions or inclusive design concepts into things a lot easier, so that it's not such a clunge. Unfortunately, most sort of mainstream frameworks don't have these kind of things built in. I came up with this. This is just a little example. The whole thing about live regions. Does everyone know what I mean by a live region? No. Okay. So a live region is a part of the page where if you populate it with content, because it has an ARIA role status or role alert, or ARIA live equals assertive or polite. When you populate it with content, it will trigger a screen reader which supports live regions, and most do, to say that content. Now, the advantage of that is that you can directly send messages to screen reader or assistive technology users without making them have to go to that element and actually focus it. So it's like the visual equivalent would be like a message actually appearing in front of you. But they're kind of complex to set up in a way. And so what I kind of wanted to do is something here where all of the structuring of the markup and actually entering the content and all the attribution and everything was done automatically. So it just had a tiny JavaScript API where you just form a live region and do .say, and it would just say what you wanted it to say whenever, which is kind of could be helpful when you're doing a script where it's quite procedural and you need to just add in little bits of contextual information for non-visual users. So that's one idea, and that's all of the stuff that that script does that you then don't have to kind of worry about. But there's a trade-off there, and the trade-off is if we're just making things like that and giving them to people so that they can just use them, developers I mean, then they're not necessarily going to understand how it works or how they'd be able to redesign it or develop around it. So there's this trade-off between convenience and understanding. And I've written jQuery UI there because jQuery UI was a really early framework that I used, which had loads of accessibility provisions built in to do with focus management, so it's better for keyboard users and all that sort of stuff. And I had no idea it was there. And then when I encountered things like seeing a focus ring around something, I thought, well, I don't want to see that, so I took it away again. So there needs to be an element of education as well as convenience. Components. Everyone, that was good. Everyone makes the same components and everyone makes them wrong in the same way. I do a lot of accessibility audits with the Paciello group, with a lot of clients, mostly American clients, and most of these organizations build the same UI components. There's not really that many different things on the web. You know, everyone has pop-up menus and everyone has drop-down menus and everyone has hamburgers and all of that sort of stuff. And they're all predictably inaccessible in the same ways. And that's why I started writing this blog, inclusivecomponents.design. And the idea there is that it's going over all of those common components that everyone uses and everyone breaks in the same way, and trying to recreate those components in a sort of pattern library fashion, and build in and explain why that they need to have certain provisions for accessibility. So I am looking today for ideas. If anyone has read the blog and they've thought, oh, it would be really cool if Heydon covered this particular component, then do grab me and we can have a chat about that. At this point, I got the numbering sort of started to go wrong, and I thought I'd own that. So it went like 1, 2, 4, 4, 6, and so I just decided to throw random numbers in. So this isn't in any particular order. And there aren't more than 103 points, so don't worry. Dynamic content, that's somewhere where we go wrong. And this sort of pushes the idea of inclusive design, because we often think of inclusive design is about disability, but by design, and designing for disability. But actually, it can be all sorts of things to do with performance, to do with device compatibility, and also to do with being able to accept reasonable levels of content. We don't do our designs thinking about content well enough, and the fact that content's going to change, right? The old joke about CSS is awesome there. So, for instance, if someone has a Sri Lankan name and Sri Lankan surnames tend to be much longer and it doesn't fit into the UI, that is a barrier to inclusion, because it means users, perhaps who have Sri Lankan names, will break the interface. And what does that mean? Does that mean you kick them off the site, or does it mean that that they get to see a really broken-looking experience? It's not good. So there is an element of inclusion to content as well. Your design has to be flexible. I've written this script called forcefeed.js. If anyone would like to contribute towards that, then please, that would be great. And it's just a simple little script which allows you to add these data force feed attributes to elements, and then you can say, well, just put 2 random words in here, or put between 3 and 6 random words in here, or sorry, sentences in this case. And then you just add that to the design that you're working on, and then as you refresh the page, it kind of recycles the content, and you get an idea of actually how good that page is at dealing with different levels of content. Yeah, number 7, fuck grouping people by their tools. Okay, so this one, the idea that screen reader users are all blind is not correct. Of course, many are, but also some people with different learning disabilities use screen readers. People with low literacy, it helps because sometimes actually reading is not as easy as hearing language. Like for me, I understand Chinese better if it's spoken to me. I certainly can't understand it by reading it. People have a second language. And also shortcuts, because one advantage of screen readers is that they provide loads of keyboard shortcuts, so it's easier to get around different parts of the page, whereas keyboard users, sighted keyboard users who don't have a screen reader running, don't get those shortcuts, which means that they, if there's loads of different interactive elements on the page, I mean, they have to arduously keep pressing tab to get to where they are. They can't jump between regions. So I've heard of people who actually have screen readers running and then the sound turned off, and they will use just so that they can use the keyboard shortcuts. So it's just, screen readers are just a tool. Don't think about it in terms of identity. They're a thing that people, all sorts of different people can use. Same with keyboards. It's not just for people with permanent motor impairments. Some people just like to use the keyboard for comfort. If I'm filling out a form, there's no way I'm going to do it by clicking on input fields with a mouse. Temporary injuries. I broke my wrist the other day. I was explaining to Rodney. I drank a lot of absinthe and then did some kickboxing training and smashed my wrist. That meant that I had to adapt and use keyboard and mouse differently. Or you might just have a technical failure, like a broken trackpad that takes you by surprise, and you don't have time to replace it. It's just providing different inputs or different ways of inputting things so that things are more robust. Intersectionality. Have I spelled that right? I think I've spelled that right. So I guess what I'm addressing here is that accessibility is one piece of a puzzle, or disability rights are one piece of a much larger puzzle. And it is a political thing. It's a very political thing. Or it's political, as I put it in here. So it's part of a, so how can I put this? All of these groups are people that some people don't want to exist, right? So these people are all on the same side, really, or we should be all on the same side. And they all cross over as well, hence intersectionality. And so I think it's important to remember when you're working on accessibility, you're doing something political, but also that it's part of a larger picture of resistance against the kind of people who just don't give a fuck about you, right? I read about this the other day, the Red Tape Initiative. So this is a thing, Brexit? Anyone heard of Brexit? I hear about it a lot in the news. I don't actually get any content or information about it. I just hear the word said a lot. But what happened was after the Brexit vote went through, this organisation appeared. And basically, they're literally a small cabal of millionaires. It includes Michael Gove, the British politician who looks a bit like a fire-damaged ventriloquist doll. Him and I think Oliver Letwin, who's also a Conservative MP or former MP, and a bunch of others, and they've set up this Red Tape Initiative. Now, in Britain, red tape means bureaucracy, whereas I think really what it means is rights and regulations and decency. And so what they want to do is they want to take advantage of Brexit to take away a lot of the laws and protections for people who are vulnerable, including people with disabilities. So that's something to bear in mind. Which leads me on to empathy. Now, obviously, I did my slightly awkward introduction about the various challenges that I face. And sometimes people think it's important that you need to have empathy to understand what it's like for a different person to use a screen reader or access web content or what have you. You need to get into their shoes. And that can sort of help to sort of, use devices and gadgets to try and emulate what it's like. But as my article that I read a little while ago, What Breaking My Wanking Claw Taught Me About Accessibility, you don't really need to actually go through that if you're able to just imagine other people do things differently. It's more of an intellectual leap, if you sort of mean, and not very much of a leap. This is how I always explain my clinical anxiety and panic disorder to people. That's what worry is, and that's what clinical anxiety is. And a number of times I had to try and explain that to people, and for them to just look at me like I was showing a card trick to a dog was really frustrating. And I guess it helped me appreciate that it must be similar for people with other kinds of hurdles and physical disabilities as well. So empathy is important. It's important to be able to appreciate that people see and experience things differently, but also it doesn't take much to just go, well, yeah, people are different. So that's that. Empathy vanquishes frippery, though. Frippery is one of my favourite words. It's sort of things which are kind of unimportant. They're sort of things that we worry about too much, I guess. So, like, we might get really excited about the differences between these two particular shades of blue on these two buttons. But of course, actually, there are very few people, actual end users or people who actually use your products who give a fuck about the difference between that blue button and that blue button. And when you get empathetic about things, what you do is you begin to appreciate what really matters to people, like people who actually need to get banking done or whatever. They want things to be clear and simple. They don't give a shit whether it's got a slightly pastel-y hue or anything like that. So it kind of makes you appreciate your priorities a bit better, I guess. I actually did a usability study a long time ago when I was working for a design firm in Norwich. And it was for a product for people who were claiming disability benefits. So we needed test groups of users or potential users to come in and test this product. And inevitably, and sort of unironically, I suppose, lots of people didn't turn up due to the fact that their disabilities disallowed them to, and they just weren't having a good enough day to be able to make it. One guy who did turn up, it took him 10 minutes to get up one flight of stairs into the room where we were doing the testing, and then he had to have another 10-minute break to get over that. Now, that is not someone who would give a shit about which kind of blue you've got on your button, right? Okay. Documentation. This is something I've been working on for a little while with the Passiona group. It's a product now called Cuppa. It used to be called Infusion, but someone alerted me to the fact that someone has a 10-year-old JavaScript framework, which is amazing. I didn't realize they lasted that long, which had the same name. So we've had to change the name to Cuppa, which is fine. Basically, it's a way for making pattern libraries or documentation, but in a way that's has a lot of inclusive design and accessibility features. So the actual outputted documentation site has things like, for instance, in the navigation, your sort of current page thing here actually has ARIA currents, which is now quite well supported. So this is the accessible way through ARIA to highlight non-visually the link within a set of steps or a set of choices, which is the current one, and it will force screen readers to announce current link or link current. So I put that in. That works quite well. So if you want to use that in your designs, like if you have your horizontal navigation across the top of the page, you can put ARIA current on the like a visually highlighted one. Needed a way to represent file systems, because if you're documenting a digital product, obviously the structure of the file system sometimes is important. And so I noticed that someone had done this really cool ASCII representation of it using all of these characters. And I spent an afternoon on a Saturday turning that into nested lists, which uses pseudo content to make it still look like ASCII. The advantage of which, of course, is if you're a screen reader user who's trying to get a feel for the actual structure, then you'll still be able to attain that, because nested lists are able to describe depth. There's also some sort of generally inclusive design features built into this system, like automatic tables of contents. So if you write in Markdown, if there's more than two H2s in that Markdown file, automatically you'll get a table of contents appear at the top with links down to those sections, which enable folks to accessibly be able to traverse the page and go between sections. And of course, it's an offline app, and that's inclusive in the sense that it means I can read my documentation on a plane whilst I'm doing a long-haul flight, so that's good. So it's a PWA, which is, well, it's a product which helps you make PWAs of documentation, essentially. If you're interested in that and you'd like to contribute to it, then please chat with me. It's built in Hugo, but then I've designed all the front end there as well. You'll be able to traverse around it quite easily. Yeah, number 666, your fucking brand. This is about defending bad accessibility choices based on your brand. So you've decided that in your brand, you have a very light grey text for your links, and you cannot possibly not use that. I'm kind of subtweeting someone I was working with not very long ago who persistently had really unreadable light links in their branding. But the point is that your brand is what people think of you. It's not your colors or any specific sort of aesthetic. And if you have links like that, people are going to think you're an arsehole, because it means that you can't read your links. So your brand, your actual brand suffers, right? So that's what you've got to think about with branding. I think it's one of the hardest things to actually get people to change in favor of a more accessible solution is their brand, because it's something that's emotive and it's something they're really committed to. And if in any way you can encourage people to just develop an accessible color scheme and branding to begin with, then you're on to a winner. Okay, single page applications. I really abhor having to use things like Angular and stuff like that to do really simple single page applications, because all a single page application is really is a router between things which look like pages. The whole advantage of a single page application is that you keep the same data on one page, but it appears that you're going between different screens, right? That's all it really does. All the other stuff is kind of added extras and API-ishness and all of that. So what if we just designed an accessible way just to do that? And you can, because browsers actually fucking do that in the first place already, because we have hash fragments, and these are sort of equivalent to roots. So you have that in your location, in your actual URL. That corresponds to an ID, which would be on a container element, so that's like your view element in your markup. And then you have links, which actually help you go between each one. And in fact, if you use the CSS target pseudo class, then you can actually make those views appear and disappear, and that's that's without any JavaScript. And you just have the standard hash change event, which is well supported, which means that you can fire an event when the user travels between each. So actually, you can do all that very easily with vanilla JavaScript and standard browser behavior. It's really important to embrace standard browser behavior because it's what users expect, and it's also really performant. There's the amount of times that you see people like recreate stuff with JavaScript, which browsers do anyway, it's kind of sad. So I made this little thing here. This is essentially, it's a routing system, but it has accessibility built into it, and it's 1.4 kilobytes gzipped. I think Angular is 120 kilobytes or something like that. That's it. There, that's the script. And you can do stuff like this. So you build a routes object. So you put an ID of to-dos, would be a name of one route, give it a label, and then you have this arrived event, which is based on the hash change event, and then you can do some stuff in there when the person arrives, and also you can use a departed method as well. So for instance, when they've written a to-do in this case, you can save some settings, and next time they try and write a to-do, local storage will determine that, oh, well, they wrote one like this before, pre-populate these options or what have you. It's a very basic example. And then you just start it like that. So it's really simple. And then obviously you would want to add in loads of other stuff probably in a much more complex application, but this is the skeleton for it. And it has all of this accessibility stuff built in. So it manages focus between the views. So when the user clicks a link which goes to one view, not only does it fire the events, but it also moves keyboard focus there, and that's really important for keyboard accessibility. Otherwise, it would leave them in another location. And also, by not focusing something, then the screen reader output doesn't occur, so you wouldn't actually hear a change of context either. It updates the title value every time you switch between routes as well, so that sort of names a page in screen readers. And uses ARIA current, so all of the links on the page when you go to a new route will then have, which correspond to that hash fragment, will have ARIA current on them, and you can use that as a styling hook as well. And there's a kind of labeling algorithm here, which kind of makes it easy to make sure that that labels aren't missing. accessible labels, that is. So what it does is it will take the text content of the first H1 or H2 for that view element. If that doesn't exist, it will take the label from the root object, which you put in the when you initialized it, and as a last resort, it will just take the root ID, which will be a string of some kind, which will be kind of readable-ish in most cases. So it has fallbacks in there, so there'll be some form of accessible fallback there. And that's what it looks like there. So I see this a lot. Folks will use ARIA and think, oh, that's cool, I'll just put an ARIA label on this element. ARIA label won't get read out unless the element has a correct role. Now, certain elements already have an implicit role, like button. So a button, if that has ARIA label on it, that ARIA label will supersede the text content of that button, or it will just, it will stand in the stead of a missing text node. But for things like this is like a group labeling mechanism. So when you enter the div and you focus something else, it will first announce that it is a region. And because it has the role of region, it will also read ARIA label equals to-do list. If role equals region wasn't there, it wouldn't read out the ARIA label. It just wouldn't think it was an element which was suitable for that. Principles. So recently, me and Leonie Watson and Henny Swan and Ian Pouncey, who are kind of UX people involved with the Paciello group, decided we needed some principles. We've got WCAG for like hard and fast, where you go wrong, kind of, success or fail stuff for accessibility. We thought for inclusive design, we need some kind of broader principles about it. So we came up with these inclusive design principles, and that's at inclusivedesignprinciples.org. And so it's things like this, like offer choice. So this is like a classic one where sometimes folks go wrong. You have like a visualization or a graph, and someone who's using a screen reader wouldn't be able to interpret that without some serious wrangling with some ARIA. So what you do is you provide a table, which is a kind of alternative method of expressing the same information. And what you do then is you decide that screen reader users are going to be the blind screen reader users are going to be the only people who want to access that table. So you take this and you put like a visually hidden class on it, so it's not there in a page. Now that's a mistake in terms of it's kind of an accessibility provision, but it's a mistake in terms of inclusive design, because actually people like me don't want to look at shitty visualizations. I want to look at fucking tables because they're easier for me to read. And also I can extract data from that table, so it's kind of convenient. I can just go to different columns and I can copy paste or whatever. So we added this principle of choice, and the idea not everything needs an alternative way of looking or reading the same information, because some things are just quite straightforward. But a lot of the time, if it's complex, then offering people other ways of exploring the same information is really helpful. And that's independent of any specific groups in terms of disability or anything. I'm going to be doing a workshop soon, so I just wanted to get an idea of what kind of things folks like in workshops. So this idea basically was to prototype and build and test just one component in a day, like a day-long workshop. Does that sound like a bad idea? Like, do you think that's even possible to do one component in a day? It would be a simple component, maybe a voting widget or something like that. And I think the method would be to go from paper to HTML into JavaScript and CSS, and then do testing at the end of the day. I feel like that would probably be a tight day, but I think it's probably possible. And it will focus a lot on HTML, because I love HTML, and it makes a big difference. And it will be plain JavaScript, probably, for the most part. Hands up who likes working in groups in workshops. So like 2 people working together, and who prefers working on their own when they're doing a workshop? Okay, so more popular with groups. Okay, well, thanks. So I will set something up soon, and it will be probably here and in the Netherlands as well, and possibly the UK. I'm going to skip this one because it's boring. Ah, right. Okay. Yeah. Here we go. Using the right technologies. So I saw this thing the other day, this thing called Focusingly, which is a JavaScript library for doing focus styles, which are better than default focus styles. Right, so this is, like, I don't want to have a go at the person who made this, because they're trying to do the right thing, but I have to say that a 2 kilobyte minified JavaScript library dependency for doing what is essentially outline solid 2 bits, outline offset 2 bits, is not how to do it. And this is another broadly inclusive design thing. Either way, you get a focus style, right? But actually, providing a focus style with JavaScript is more brittle. It's less efficient, and it's more likely to fail, and so it's not as robust overall as a result. So it's better not to do that, I would say. This is a brilliant quote that I read the other day. The strength of JavaScript is that you can do anything, the weakness is that you will. And yeah, if you can solve stuff with just HTML and CSS, you don't need JavaScript, go for it. With the caveat that some things, some people go about trying to do things just with HTML and CSS, like kind of as a challenge, and then they'll end up with really inaccessible solutions. So the so-called checkbox hack is a good example of this. It means that you can kind of create a menu system where when you click on a button, because the checkbox changes state, you can hook into that, and then you can sort of use it as a toggle button. But the problem is that in screen readers, it's read out as a checkbox, and nobody's expecting a checkbox to actually be something that operates a menu. So you have to be careful about going too far with just a pure CSS, or as I call it, HTML with CSS. You can't really do pure CSS. It doesn't really work. Final note then, sorry, I've been talking rather long. Final note is about my book. If you bought my book, Inclusive Design Patterns, I gave a lot of my royalties away to a very left-wing cause. So sorry about that, anyone here who is staunchly right-wing. I doubt anyone is if you're at an accessibility meetup. But this was the Democratic Socialists in the States, and they sent me a nice handwritten thank you note. So that was sort of for me, but really more for you if you bought my book. So thank you for that. And I actually, when Yoshi was saying there is one more ticket left to Accessibility Club, I said, great, so the last person to sign up can get a free copy of my book. And then I realized that I hadn't signed up, so it turns out I'm actually the last person to sign up. But I've read my book and I wasn't impressed. So, whoever was the person who, do you know who was the person?
I will look it up.
You can look it up. Okay, then I have a copy of my book that you can have. Thank you ever so much for listening for such a long fucking time.